Using the Paint Bucket tool, you can add a fill to a shape or change the color of a shape's fill, and using the Ink Bottle tool, you can paint strokes. In this movie, we'll check out how to do that. So on the stage here, I have some art. So there's a circle with no fill inside. I'll use the Paint Bucket tool to add a fill. So I'll select the Paint Bucket tool from the toolbar. It's in the flyout menu with the Ink Bottle tool. Then I'll select a fill color and simply click inside of the circle to apply the fill. Notice in the options area of the toolbar that I have the Lock Fill button selected. The Lock Fill button is for applying the same gradient to multiple shapes. Again, we'll talk more about gradients in another movie. So I'm going to pan to the right for our next example with the Paint Bucket tool. You'll notice that this stroke has a gap. So when I click and I try to paint in it, it doesn't work. Using the Close Gaps setting in the options area of the toolbar, you can tell Flash to close gaps that are a certain width. So I opened up the Gap Size drop-down menu. You have the option to not close gaps at all, to close small gaps, medium gaps, large gaps. Now, all of these terms sound really relative, and that's just because they are relative. If you look really closely at the size of the gaps in these little icons, that is the gap size that Flash will fill. So it doesn't refer to an exact pixel number, but it's more of a visual thing. So gaps will be filled depending on your level of zoom. So if I zoom in really far, I'm less likely to fill in a gap no matter what setting I have. But if I zoom out, I'm more likely to be able to close the gap. So I had the same setting of close large gaps on, and it didn't work before. And once I zoomed out, I could click and it would work again because that gap size got smaller when I zoomed out. Now that may not sound extremely intuitive to you, but just take a mental note of that being the way that Flash works. For the brush tool and the eraser tool, and for the gaps with the Paint Bucket tool, the degree in which you are zoomed makes a big difference. Now let's take a look at the Ink Bottle tool. I'm going to zoom into the third example here. So I have a drop with a circular background that doesn't have a stroke like the other backgrounds do. Now, in other programs like Adobe Illustrator, shapes all have a stroke and a fill, and so you simply select the shape and set the stroke. While Flash's object drawing mode works that way, merge drawing does not. If I select the shape and look in the properties panel and try to set the stroke, the option is actually grayed out. So we'll have to use the Ink Bottle tool to set a stroke. So I'll select the Ink Bottle tool from the toolbar. I'll choose White Stroke. Then I'll make sure to deselect the shape so that I get the Ink Bottle tool options instead of the shape options in the properties panel. And I'll set the stroke height to 3 pixels. And then I'll click at the edge of the shape where I want to apply the stroke. And there it goes. And just keep in mind, if you ever want to delete a stroke, you can select the stroke, and then using the stroke color picker, you can click the No Stroke button. It's a white box with a red line through it. So using the Paint Bucket tool and the Ink Bottle tool, you can control the fills and strokes of your shapes.